The Panama Canal is an artificial 82-kilometer waterway that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, cutting across the Isthmus of Panama, and is a conduit for maritime trade. An average of 200 million liters of fresh water is used in a single passing of a ship. The canal is threatened by low water levels during droughts. It is one of the largest and most difficult engineering projects ever undertaken. Colombia, France, and later the United States controlled the territory surrounding the canal during construction. The U.S. took over the project in 1904 and opened the canal in 1914. It is now managed and operated by the Panamanian government-owned Panama Canal Authority. A third, wider lane of locks was constructed between September 2007 and May 2016. Annual traffic has risen from about 1,000 ships in 1914, when the canal opened, to 14,702 vessels in 2008. By 2012, more than 815,000 vessels had passed through the canal. In 2017, it took ships an average of 11.38 hours to pass between the canal's two outer locks. The American Society of Civil Engineers has ranked the Panama Canal one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The earliest record regarding a canal across Central America was in 1534. Numerous canals were built in other countries in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The success of the Erie Canal through central New York in the United States in the 1820s and the collapse of the Spanish Empire in Latin America resulted in growing American interest in building an interoceanic canal. Great Britain attempted to develop a canal in 1843. They referred to it as the Atlantic and Pacific Canal, and it was a wholly British endeavor. William Henry Aspinwall, who had won the federal subsidy to build and operate the Pacific Mail steamships at around the same time, benefited from the gold discovery. Aspinwall's route included steamship legs from New York City to Panama, and from Panama to California, with an overland portage through Panama. This route with an overland leg in Panama was soon frequently traveled, as it provided one of the fastest connections between San Francisco, California, and the East Coast cities, about 40 days transit in total. Nearly all the gold that was shipped out of California went by the fast Panama route. In 1850, the United States began construction of the Panama Railroad, now called the Panama Railway, to cross the isthmus. It opened in 1855. While it was a lengthy project, they were encouraged to plan for a canal to cross the Panamanian Isthmus. The first attempt to construct a canal through what was then Colombia's province of Panama began on 1st January 1881. The project was inspired by the diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was able to raise considerable funds in France. As a result of the huge profits generated by his successful construction of the Suez Canal. Although the Panama Canal needed to be only 40% as long as the Suez Canal, it was much more of an engineering challenge. Because of the combination of tropical rainforests, debilitating climate, the need for canal locks, and the lack of any ancient route to follow, the dense jungle was alive with venomous snakes, insects, and spiders, but the worst challenges were yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases, which killed thousands of workers. By 1884, the death rate was over 200 per month. Workers had to continually widen the main cut through the mountain at Culebra and reduce the angles of the slopes to minimize landslides into the canal. Steam shovels were used in the construction of the canal, purchased from Bay City Industrial Works, a business owned by William L. Clements in Bay City, Michigan. Bucket chain excavators manufactured by both Alphonse Couvriax and Veher and Richmond and Buet were also used. Other mechanical and electrical equipment was limited in capabilities, and steel equipment rusted rapidly in the rainy climate. In France, Lesseps kept the investment and supply of workers flowing long after it was obvious that the targets were not being met, but eventually the money ran out. The French effort went bankrupt in 1889 after reportedly spending $287 million. An estimated 22,000 men died from disease and accidents, and the savings of 800,000 investors were lost. Work was suspended on 15th May, and in the ensuing scandal, known as the Panama Affair, some of those deemed responsible were prosecuted, including Gustave Eiffel. Lesseps and his son Charles were found guilty of misappropriation of funds and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. In 1894, a second French company, the Compagnie Nouvelle du Canal de Panama, was created to take over the project. Philippe Bonnevarella, the French manager of the new Panama Canal Company, eventually managed to persuade Lesseps that a lock-and-lake canal was more realistic than a sea-level canal. Many aspects of the plan were similar in principle to the canal that was finally built by the Americans in 1914. It was a lock canal with 2 high-level lakes to lift ships up and over the continental divide. Artificial lakes would be formed by damming the Chagres River at Bohio and Alhujuela, providing both flood control and electric power. For $10 million and an annual payment, it would have granted the United States a renewable lease in perpetuity from Colombia on the land proposed for the canal. The treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate on 14 March 1903, but the Senate of Colombia unanimously rejected the treaty. Since it had become significantly unpopular in Bogota due to concerns over insufficient compensation, threat to sovereignty, and perpetuity, Roosevelt changed tactics, based in part on the Mallory-Nobedlack Treaty of 1846, and actively supported the separation of Panama from Colombia. Shortly after recognizing Panama, he signed a treaty with the new Panamanian government under terms similar to the Heheran Treaty. On 2 November 1903, U.S. warships blocked sea lanes against possible Colombian troop movements en route to put down the Panama Rebellion. Panama declared independence on 3 November 1903. The United States quickly recognized the new nation. The Colombian troops dispatched to Panama were hastily assembled conscripts with little training. The reason an army of conscripts was sent was that it was the best response the Colombians could muster, as Colombia still was recovering from a civil war between liberals and conservatives from October 1899 to November 1902, known as the Thousand Days War. The peace treaty that ended the Thousand Days War was signed on the USS Wisconsin on 21 November 1902. On 6 November 1903, Philippe Bonnevarella, as Panama's ambassador to the United States, signed the Bonnevarella Treaty, granting rights to the United States to build and indefinitely administer the Panama Canal Zone and its defenses. This is sometimes misinterpreted as the 99-year lease, because of misleading wording included in Article 22 of the agreement. Almost immediately, the treaty was condemned by many Panamanians as an infringement on their country's new national sovereignty. This would later become a contentious diplomatic issue among Colombia, Panama, and the United States. President Roosevelt famously stated, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." Several parties in the United States called this an act of war on Colombia. The New York Times described the support given by the United States to Bonnevarella as an act of sordid conquest. The New York Evening Post called it a vulgar and mercenary venture. The U.S. maneuvers are often cited as the classic example of U.S. gunboat diplomacy in Latin America, and the best illustration of what Roosevelt meant by the old African adage, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." After the revolution in 1903, the Republic of Panama became a U.S. protectorate until 1939. In return, Colombia recognized Panama as an independent nation. The U.S. formally took control of the canal property on 4 May 1904, inheriting from the French a depleted workforce and a vast jumble of buildings, infrastructure, and equipment, much of it in poor condition. A U.S. government commission, the Isthmian Canal Commission, ICC, was established to oversee construction. It was given control of the Panama Canal Zone, over which the United States exercised sovereignty. Stevens tried to provide accommodation in which the workers could work and live in reasonable safety and comfort. Colonel William C. Gorgas had been appointed Chief Sanitation Officer of the canal construction project in 1904. Gorgas implemented a range of measures to minimize the spread of deadly diseases, particularly yellow fever and malaria, which had recently been shown to be mosquito-borne following the work of Cuban epidemiologist Carlos Finlay and American pathologist Walter Reed. After 2 years of extensive work, the mosquito-spread diseases were nearly eliminated. Despite the monumental effort, about 5,600 workers died from disease and accidents during the U.S. construction phase of the canal. Besides healthier and far better living conditions for the workers, another benefit given to American citizens working on the canal was a medal for 2 years of service. Designed by Victor D. Brainer and featuring the then current president, they were popularly known as the Roosevelt Medal. In 1905, a U.S. engineering panel was commissioned to review the canal design, which had not been finalized. In January 1906, the panel, in a majority of 8-5, recommended to President Roosevelt a sea-level canal, as had been attempted by the French and temporarily abandoned by them in 1887 for a 10-lock system designed by Philippe Bonnevarella, and definitively in 1898 for a lock-and-leg canal, designed by the Kamite technique of the Compagnie Nouvelle du Canal de Panama, as conceptualized by Adolphe Gaudin de Lepinay in 1879. But in 1906, Stevens, who had seen the Chagres in full flood, was summoned to Washington. He declared a sea-level approach to be an entirely untenable proposition. He argued in favor of a canal using a lock system to raise and lower ships from a large reservoir 85 feet, 26 meters, above sea level. This would create both the largest dam, Gatun Dam, and the largest human-made lake, Gatun Lake, in the world at that time. Gatun Lake would connect to the Pacific through the mountains at the Gaylord, Culebra, Cut. The construction of a canal with locks required the excavation of more than 17 million CUYD, 13 million M3, of material over and above the 30 million CUYD, 23 million M3, excavated by the French. In many places, the new Gatun Lake flooded over the original rail line, and a new line had to be constructed above Gatun Lake's waterline. Between 1912 and 1914 there was a controversy about the tolls for the canal. Construction of locks on the Panama Canal. 1913 Goethals replaces Stevens as chief engineer in 1907. Stevens resigned as chief engineer. His replacement, appointed by President Theodore Roosevelt, was U.S. Army Major George Washington Goethals of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Goethals divided the engineering and excavation work into 3 divisions: Atlantic, Central, and Pacific. This flooded the Culebra Cut, thereby joining the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans via the Panama Canal. Alexander La Valley, a floating crane built by Lobnitz and Company and launched in 1887, was the first self-propelled vessel to transit the canal from ocean to ocean. This vessel crossed the canal from the Atlantic in stages during construction, finally reaching the Pacific on 7 January 1914. SS Cristobal, a cargo and passenger ship built by Maryland Steel, and launched in 1902 as SS Tremont on 3 August 1914, was the first ship to transit the canal from ocean to ocean. The construction of the canal was completed in 1914, 401 years after Panama was first crossed overland by the Europeans in Vasco Nunes de Balboa's party of conquistadors. The United States spent almost $500 million, roughly equivalent to $15.2 billion in 2023, to finish the project. This was by far the largest American engineering project to date. The canal was formally opened on 15 August 1914, with the passage of the cargo ship SS Ancon. The opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 caused a severe drop in traffic along Chilean ports due to shifts in maritime trade routes, despite the closure of the canal for nearly 7 months after a landslide in the Culebra Cut on 18 September 1915. The burgeoning sheep farming business in southern Patagonia suffered a significant setback by the change in trade routes, as did the economy of the Falkland Islands. Completed in 1935, the dam created Madden Lake, later Alajuela Lake, which provides additional water storage for the canal. In 1939, construction began on a further major improvement, a new set of locks large enough to carry the larger warships that the United States was building at the time and planned to continue building. The work proceeded for several years, and significant excavation was carried out on the new approach channels, but the project was cancelled after World War II. After World War II, U.S. control of the canal and the canal zone surrounding it became contentious. Relations between Panama and the United States became increasingly tense. Panamanian unrest culminated in riots on Martyrs' Day, 9 January 1964, when about 20 Panamanians and 35 U.S. soldiers were killed. President Jimmy Carter's speech upon signing the Panama Canal Treaty, On 7 September 1977, the treaty was signed by President of the United States Jimmy Carter and Omar Torrijos, de facto leader of Panama. The Panama Canal remains one of the chief revenue sources for Panama. On 21 December 2024, President-elect Donald Trump asserted that the United States should retake control of the Panama Canal from Panama, claiming that the rates Panama was charging American ships were exorbitant and in violation of the Torrijos-Carter treaties. The following day, Trump claimed that the canal was falling into the wrong hands, referring to China. He denied that the United States was being unfairly charged or that anyone besides Panama was in full control of the canal, and affirmed that the canal was part of the country's inalienable patrimony.